Now, the South African government is preparing for this year's BRICS Business Forum. This year will be different, though, amid the impact COVID-19 has had on world economies, with third world countries particularly devastated. But Team SA says it's ready to show that the country is open for business. We're joined now by Presidency Head of Investment and Infrastructure, Kgosientso Ramokgopa. Dr. Ramokgopa, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. Now, is it still an easy task to sell South Africa to the world? Do investors, still show interest when you say you're from South Africa, given all the corruption that has been exposed?
Good morning, Masego, and good morning to the viewers. Well, I guess investors will want to come into a space where there's the regulatory environment is such that it's welcoming to investment. You also have the rule of law, the stability of the economy, the political stability is also key, but also an environment that allows for investors to invest behind a credible infrastructure project pipeline. And yes, I think one thing that is soiling, if you like, the investment environment in the country is the rampant corruption that we have been seeing, the issues of malfeasance and leakage. But the one comfort that we have as we convey the South African story is to demonstrate that there's independent bodies that are charged with the responsibility of discharging and prosecuting the rule of law, that are beginning to ensure that we go after those that are found guilty or alleged to have been involved in acts of corruption. So I guess that the work that the various law enforcement agencies have been doing over the past few weeks is encouraging, and it begins to embolden our story as we engage with the investors. But I guess it's the totality, or if you like, the net package that we are providing that provides a compelling story why South Africa should remain an investment destination. And I guess that the President's presentation of the reconstruction and recovery plan does give additional assurance, because if you remember, one of the aspects that the President refers to, or if you like, the objectives of the plan, is to ensure that we fight against crime and corruption. So we're beginning to ensure that there's greater traction in conveying that message. And then the second part is that we have been successful in galvanizing non-state actors, so business and community have been at the forefront, if you like, at the formulation of this response and conveying and articulating the South African story to the investors. So it's not just through the lenses of the state, but also other multiple actors are beginning to work together with government to ensure that the story that we convey to the investors is a solid and compelling one. So I'm buoyant about the prospects of additional investments in the country. Obviously, in the immediate future, it's going to be extremely difficult given the pandemic and the fact that there's a second surge in other parts of the world. So many of the investors, the big liquidity that is there, is looking inwards to protect domestic investments. But we are of the view that the South African story has been resilient and will continue to convey that South African story. And I guess that the curve is going to peak in the next 8 to 10 months. So like I said, we are very buoyant about the prospects of investment.
Now let's talk about that economic recovery plan, R1 trillion going into infrastructure to revitalize our battling economy, create jobs, etc. How are you, as head of the investment infrastructure, going to ensure that the money is not going to fall through the cracks, or we're not going to see any corruption taking place with that money?
No, I think it's a fair question, especially on the back of what has been happening. Just a bit of context with regards to the 1 trillion rands investment in infrastructure in the next 4 years. I guess people need to understand that there's an appreciation in government that the fiscal headspace has diminished. So we need to look at the non-traditional forms of financing infrastructure. The national purse has contracted. We had to redirect resources to ensure that we keep firms alive, to ensure that we provide additional support to the poor. So there are multiple interventions we are making. The first one is to ensure that we produce a credible infrastructure project pipeline, and the projects that we are producing will be underpinned by independent, sustainable, and verifiable, if you like, revenue streams, and we'll be packaging those projects for market investments. You remember that we had done the same exercise about on the 23rd of June, and we attracted 340 billion rand. So we continue to do that. So it's about investment in our ability to package and prepare projects for market participation. So we raise money through the debt capital markets. The second one is to ensure that we are able to fully exploit what we call the infrastructure fund. So remember, the president did make an announcement that we are now operationalizing the infrastructure fund. It's a 100 billion rand facility. This is a blended financing mechanism. So blended simply means the state says we are prepared to take the first loss, and because the state is taking the first loss, you are de-risking the project, and you are going to allow for greater private sector investments. And we know that the ratio really is something between about 1 to 5. So if we put 1 rand, we are likely going to crowd in 5 rand of private sector investment. And then the third part is that we are going to introduce new financing instruments such as project bonds and also the green infrastructure bonds to ensure that the big liquidity of opportunities that is there globally with regards to investments in the green project, we get to exploit it. We must tap into that facility. And then the fourth one is a question that you are raising, to ensure that there's greater credibility, ensure that we are addressing leakage, malfeasance, and any form of conduct that can undermine investor confidence. There are 2 things that we are going to do. The first one is the introduction of an open tender system. So it has been introduced in other parts of the country. I think in Gauteng, they've attempted to do that. So I think we want to make it fully fledged. So essentially is to say that every stage of the procurement process must be transparent, must be open to the public to be able to witness that happening. And then the second...
Sorry, can I just bring in a question there, Dr. Ramokgopa? How is this transparency going to be different to what we were promised with PPE tenders, which were transparent and centralized, but people were still able to steal and loot?
Now, let me explain.
Yes, just the difference there.
The of how you make this transparent. So what people know is that there's call for tender, so it's a public exercise, gets to be advertised in the various media platforms, newspapers, websites, so on and so forth, and then you respond to that tender. And then at the point at which there's a closing of the tender period, they open the submissions, if you like, the responses from the various contractors. Let's use a construction tender as a typical example, and they read out what the prices are, so that is public. So it's what has been happening. But what has not been public is the deliberation of the various committees. If you like, the bid committee, the evaluation committee, and the adjudication committee. Those conversations are happening behind closed doors. So we think that it is important that we give the public side, or at least at the most basic minimum, those that have responded to the call for submission, to be able to witness exactly what is it, how do those that are entrusted with the responsibility of evaluating and adjudication, how do they arrive at those determinations? And thirdly is that you make also public the rationale, also how you have arrived at the scoring, so that this process is not behind closed doors, is not something that is not open to the general public. So that's what we mean by open tender. So every stage of the process has to be accounted for, and then everyone can have an appreciation if you like, to witness the stages of that exercise. And in that way, we think that we will be in a position to bring down any acts of malfeasance. We'll be able to detect if there are any leakages. So I just said that's the one part. And then the second part is that the work that we're doing in the infrastructure space is such that the big amounts of investments, they come from the private sector. Some of them, like I said, we're raising them from the debt capital market, the multilateral development banks, the DFIs, and also the commercial banks. They are placing this following condition, is that they want to have see-through. So what is see-through? They want to be satisfied themselves outside the state that in fact every stage of the process meets the requirements of the law. Every stage of the process meets the requirements, constitutional requirements, transparency, value for money, and also competitiveness. So it's not just a responsibility that is the sole domain of the state, but private sector says this is our money. We really want to have a sense that indeed all that the government has promised that will be followed will indeed be followed, and that's the kind of.
Professor, I just have to get in there to fit in my last question because unfortunately I've run out of time. You know, words are great and everything looks great on paper, but action is something else. And South Africans, you know, most South Africans would say that they still don't trust anything that the government says because despite all the promises that we've had, we still see the same leaders just chopping around. So should we still trust you even with these words that you're telling us? Give us a reason why we should trust.
Well, President Ramokgopa did say about 6 months ago that we are going to ensure that there's greater effort, aggression in following up on those that are alleged to have been involved in acts of misconduct. And he did appeal for patience, and he did indicate that he's bolstering the law enforcement agencies, the NPA and the Hawks, and we can see that the appointments that the president has made, one. Two is that those that have been assigned that responsibilities have also come out in public and say they are trying to formulate strong cases, and when they go after those that are alleged to have been involved in acts of misconduct, it's a case that must be strong enough to result in a conviction. So I'm sure that you have seen this has been public. You have been covering it also on your platform, the number of arrests that have been made, and also the state coming out to say there's a strong evidence. They build a strong case. Again, is issues around asset forfeiture, that the proceeds of alleged acts of misconduct and corruption will be in the care of the state, and once the state is able to prevail before an independent court of law, we are going to take possession of that. So I'm saying that there are green shoots, there's evidence that the state is taking that kind of action, and indeed, it will continue to happen. They did come out to say there's additional arrests that are coming through, and also it's a follow-up on some of the work that is being done at the Zondo Commission. It has to be transferred to the law enforcement agencies to ensure that as the Commission is doing its work, parallel to that, we are able to ensure that we pursue convictions where there's a strong case. So I'm just saying that the public domain is littered with those examples. That is enough? No, it's certainly not enough. I mean, for us to be able to close the trust deficit, to ensure that we are on the ascendancy in regards to fighting against corruption, we really need to do more. But we have to also place greater focus on ensuring that it doesn't happen again. And those measures that I explained earlier on is part of an aggregate set of measures that are meant to ensure that we nip it at the bud. So at the source, we're able to address it. So if for one reason or the other is able to escape, find its way, the law enforcement agencies must unleash their mind. So I'm just saying this is an aggregation of the effort. It's not just the law enforcement agencies. It's about the work that we're doing to stop that from happening in the first place. And I'm confident that we're going to get it right.
All right, thank you very much. That is Dr. Ramokgopa, the head of infrastructure investment in the presidency.